Ciarán, so happy to see you again. Thank you for joining us on the Friends of Sinn Féin video podcast. We had originally scheduled to record this yesterday, and all sorts of news broke, yesterday being February 27th. And we said, why don't we wait a day and catch up and see if we can make sense of what we know so far. So welcome back. We are happy to see you. How are you doing? And can you start us off with a bit of a recap of all the news that's been breaking?
Yeah, and I think we had it, as you said, originally planned yesterday. But what happened was that the British government and the EU unveiled a new agreement, which they says would resolve the issues around the implementation of Brexit on the north of Ireland. So that'll be a bit of a game changer because it's been a number of years in the making. And not to go too far into the weeds, Greg, but just to bring people up to date, and like any good story, it starts a long, long time ago.
Yes, yeah, bring us all the way back.
For those, we say in Irish. So in 2016, in June of 2016, the British government called a referendum, and that referendum was: should Britain remain in the EU or should it leave? The only demand for this was the British Prime Minister at the time decided to call the bluff of his hard right Brexiteer wing to force a referendum, fully expecting that the referendum wouldn't pass. We now know the referendum passed in England, passed in Wales, didn't pass in Scotland, and never passed in the north of Ireland. And there was a majority in the north who wanted to remain in the EU for very simple reasons. The EU works for us and works very well for us. It promotes all Ireland trade. There's no barriers to trade north and south. People had access to European markets, had access to European universities, had full European citizenship in the north. So people voted, it came as no surprise to us that the people voted to remain in the north. And I'm going to use this phrase because it's used quite regularly by unionists. It created a democratic deficit. So people in the north voted to remain, but the British government went ahead and imposed Brexit on Ireland. And there was no votes in support of it, in terms of a majority support. And that created a number of problems, as you can imagine.
Yeah. So
the whole peace process has been about ameliorating or softening the border, having free trade, people travelling north and south.
Access.
Trade, and promoting joint prosperity.
Yeah.
And suddenly the north becomes an EU frontier. And that's the thing that Brexit basically meant that Britain left, they dragged the north out, and then the 6 counties of Ireland was pulled out with it, and the 26 remained in the EU. So it created like an EU frontier between the EU and a third country, and all that entailed. So it creates a border, and the Good Friday Agreement was about softening the border.
Yeah.
And there's a very practical solution to this. The border's 360 miles long, and it's permeable. It's crisscrossed by not only roads, but like businesses, farms. There was no idea that this would ever be an issue, and there was no consideration during Brexit, the impact on Ireland. So the obvious thing is to resolve this issue is you move the border to where it's manageable.
Yeah.
And it's manageable. There's 2 main ports of entry in the north, Belfast and Larne, less so Derry and Warrenpoint. So that if you're going to have those border sort of checks that Brexit forced
made necessary, but
you manage them at the ports.
Yeah.
So that's where the logic of it came to. So fast forward to December, and this became an issue of contention between the British and the EU, and the British had no idea, had never thought about the impact of this on Ireland, and just thought that they would steamroll it on. And thankfully, people in America cottoned on to it. And particularly within Congress, there was a growing demand that whatever Britain was going to do with Brexit, it couldn't result in a hard border in Ireland. It couldn't undermine the Good Friday Agreement.
After all the work and support for the Good Friday Agreement, which had achieved that resolution.
And I suppose what happened was that after a negotiation with Boris Johnson, and he's going to be a player that's going to keep on coming up in this saga. I'd say he's the cartoon bad guy in it all, if you want to start booing and hissing when he's mentioned, because it'll bring it right up to date with his comments of last week. So Boris Johnson went through he made this a point. He ended up becoming Prime Minister, and he struck a deal in December 2019 called the Withdrawal Agreement, and part of that was the Irish Protocol. And the Irish Protocol basically says, to make things easy, the north of Ireland would remain in the EU in terms of their single market and trade.
Mm-hmm.
Checks along the border would be moved to the ports of entry for ease and very practical reasons.
Yeah.
And it went some way to ameliorating or lessen the impact of Brexit. There's still a whole raft of other issues, and it's not consistent with the Good Friday Agreement. But that deal was done, and before the ink was dry, Boris Johnson was pulling back off it in an absolute act of bad faith, and declaring that he would unilaterally write it. Interestingly, when it was first signed, the Unionists agreed with the protocol, thought it was going to be really good for the North. Boris then changed his mind and brought forward legislation saying he would unilaterally rewrite it, which was completely illegal.
Yeah.
And in complete bad faith. And then the Unionists' position changed in support of the British government's position, and they eventually crashed government in the North to try to force a renegotiation with the EU on these issues about where checks and balances would be conducted, how the North would be governed. And
just to pause there, because I think that really is a nexus of everything that comes next, right? So there's a conflict around where ports should be, how we'll conduct trade with our trading partners, how things will be checked or not checked. And because of a shift in acceptance of the terms of an agreement, they collapsed the government. They said, we will not participate. We will act in a way that collapses the democratic will of the people. Yeah, and I think that's it exactly. And the response from the US came really strong. So, and it was President Biden laid down the markers very explicitly. He says, there can be no hard border. Find an agreement within what has been agreed. You know, it's about implementing an agreement. You can't dishonour an agreement or unilaterally rewrite it. And there can be no negative impact on the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement must be upheld. And then the US administration says, and by the way, unless these terms are met, there will be absolutely no trade deal with the British. That's right.
Between the US and the British. So suddenly, Boris Johnson and the British government had a problem. Yeah. They had broken a trade agreement with their closest partner. They had sold it on the basis of getting a trade agreement with the US. And now the US were saying, yeah, we're up for trade agreement, but you have to honour your obligations in terms of Good Friday and your obligations to the EU. Otherwise, you're in a negotiation with the bad faith actor. That's right. Yeah. So we went through the swings and roundabouts. Boris Johnson went. I almost forgot the Boris Johnson went. Then we had Liz Truss for 4 weeks.
A few minutes there. Yeah.
And then Richie Sunak came in, and Sunak then, I suppose, became a bit more engaged on the European issue. And by the way, Brexit has failed Britain. So at the minute, there's an ongoing joke that they can't get fresh tomatoes in Britain. And they tried to blame it on weather conditions in Spain, but like everybody else
seems to have tomatoes. No tomato shortage.
And so the British economy's tanked. The British economy is the worst performing economy in the G20, including Russia, which is under sanctions.
Jeez.
So that is how bad the Brexit has been, working with has been for the British. So Richie Sunak needed a deal.
Yeah.
He needed a deal with his closest trading partner in terms of the EU, and he needed to rebuild his position.
Goodwill, yeah.
So that's where we end up in an agreement now. And that agreement seems to deal with some of those concerns. It lessens regulations, it lessens checks, and it creates the ability for further input and consultation from the North into the EU. And back to Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson at the weekend tried to scupper this deal because he wants to make a political comeback, it appears. And he was quoted in the Times of London when he was asked about, well, have you considered what this will mean to America? And he said, F the Americans.
Yeah.
And that was the quote, and it wasn't denied that was said. So that's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a part of the Tory establishment who have no concern or care for Ireland or for the US. So yesterday, we have a deal with the EU. We have a deal with the EU and the British. And the next steps in that should be, yes, we will look at the detail of it, but the negotiation's done. There's no more. If there was any leverage in the first place for the DUP staying out of government, it's gone. The negotiations are finished. They should be back in government. Any points of clarification they want, how this process will roll out over the coming months, that can be done while they're in government.
Chiefly via that channel. Like that's how it is designed. If there are questions or things to be addressed, they only happen after Stormont sits.
Yeah. So I'm back to this concept of a democratic deficit. So their complaint with the EU would be implementing or imposing laws and regulations which had no oversight, and so it's a democratic deficit. We're now in a position where the DUP are refusing to form a government, which is the absolute anti-democratic approach. There was an election of May of last year. Sinn Féin came out as the largest party, and our Vice President, Michelle O'Neill, should be the First Minister in the North. So the good news is there's a deal, and it's make your mind up time, as I say, for the DUP, because there's a school of thought that says they have no interest in power sharing, because there's no unionist majority, because they have no longer that First Minister's position, and they can't stomach the idea of working alongside a Irish Republican who would be First Minister. Yeah. So we will see in the coming weeks what way that folds out. I hope that they do the right thing, they respect the vote from last May, and they get back into government and start delivering for all of our people. I'll be clear. Go ahead.
Yeah, what would be the time? Is there a sense of timeline? Is there when Windsor Framework is presented and said this is what has been negotiated, this is the path forward? Do they have a deadline by which they can say we'll be there? Or
no, it can be very elastic, and part of the it's a framework document, so part of it will be take primary legislation. I don't think it'll constitute what's called the treaty change, which brings you into a whole very formal legislative process. But there will be primary legislation, there will be votes, and it'll be an evolving framework.
I see.
Because some of the stuff isn't tied down.
Yeah.
Because it has to be through consultation. So there's no end point to this. There's not. I can't say that all of this will be in place in the next 4 weeks, 5 weeks, or 6 weeks. But what I can say is the government should be formed tomorrow.
Yeah.
And start dealing with the processes, because that is democracy and respect the vote of the people in the North.
Well, thank you for the catching up of what was a flurry of breaking news and responses from all over the world. If you on our website, you'll see a collection of the responses from American politicians, from President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Many senators and representatives weighed in as the news broke yesterday, and you can find a lot of those there. I'm happy to see you in your confines there, off of the road. Right, you were coming to us last time from an undisclosed location somewhere in New England. I think is right. You're back in more comfortable setting. What's the latest on polls and what we're seeing in kind of where things stand as far as the party share?
Well, so in the North, we're continuing to lead in the polls.
Yeah.
And we're actually slightly up on the election of May. And so we're in the low 30s there, 31%. And then in the polls at the weekend, Sinn Féin have still got a lead. Now, whether that leads in single digits or double digits depends on the poll.
Yeah.
But it's a significant lead over the other parties. And we'll move into an election in the South, I'd say, definitely within the next 2 years. It could be sooner, depending on how long this government lasts. But yeah, Sinn Féin, remarkably, whenever the last election in 2020 in the South, we had a high point of just over, I think it was 24.5%, and came out as the largest party by vote share. And there was a question, could Sinn Féin maintain that vote share in opposition?
Yeah.
And we've actually increased it. So whether we're at 31, 33 or 34%, that is consolidated and grown. And what's marked about the polls is there's you can see in terms of demographics in it, that it's a collection of younger people and young professionals, young families, people under the age of 50 who are coming to vote for Sinn Féin. That's where the majority of the votes will come from. So that's all good signs. It also causes not a problem, but it causes a challenge. But we need to get into government, and we need to be able to deliver what those people want.
That's
housing,
right.
Healthcare, prosperity, security.
Cost of living,
Yeah, and the cost of living, and a new and united Ireland.
Yeah.
That's the exciting project that we're engaged in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good to see every time these headlines come out that 30, 31, 33 share is it is incredible when taken into consideration that it was designed against that, and then, like you say, can they grow past 24? Well beyond. It's remarkable.
Yeah. So it's a good news, and when you say I'm home for a while.
Yes, but not for long. I don't think.
We will be. Marilyn McDonald and Michelle O'Neill will be travelling to Washington, New York, and Washington for the St. Patrick's Day, for a round of political engagements around St. Patrick's Day with the administration, with civic society, with Irish America, and of course with the Congress.
Yeah.
That are supporters in the Hill. And then I'll be home for a week or two, and then we'll be back in April for Easter. And
that's right.
We have a full run of Easter commemorations in San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver. So we will have plenty on. And we're working on a really big event to mark the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. So
that's right.
Watch that space.
That's exactly right. For information about all those commemorations and the big event in April, be sure to stay tuned to our newsletter and all of our social media channels. In our most recent newsletter, we asked readers, now viewers and listeners, to send in information. If you are hosting an Easter commemoration in your town or in your city, or know of one happening, we would love to know about it and help you promote it. Please fill out the form you can find on the newsletter and on the social media link tree, and we'll be happy to connect. Anything else on the horizon here in the coming days and weeks, Ciarán?
Well, as I say, hopefully we'll get Brexit resolved. We'll get the issue of Brexit has been resolved. This agreement has been reached.
Yeah.
We'd like to see government formation ASAP, because there's challenges in the north needed to be met, and we need to get the institutions up and running, and the north-south institutions up and running.
Yeah.
And they can't be allowed just to stagnate or to wait on the DUP coming to terms with us. It's very clear that there's there may be a short window for clarification, but definitely get back to government. Yeah. After that, if they're not coming back in, if they can't abide by the democracy, then we need to look beyond that. So it's going to be exciting exciting time ahead. Very busy as well.
I think also Irish America's role continues to remain as important as ever. And if you visit our site and see the representatives, senators who have led their voice to the call for return to government and for next steps, reach out to their offices and let them know that you appreciate them lending their voice to that. And if you see that your representative is not one of those folks, certainly reach out to them and encourage them to do the same.
Oh, absolutely. You know, sometimes people get them, and you hear it all the time.
Yeah.
Well, there's no point. What difference can we make?
Yeah.
Here, if you want a very real example,
yeah.
Boris Johnson is not going to listen to anybody. He's going to plough ahead and do his own thing in terms of the north of Ireland, and in terms of Brexit, and in terms of our peace processes. It was America that stopped him in his tracks. It was the US intervention and blocking and raising the issue of a trade deal with them brought the British government, beyond no illusion, they brought the British government to the negotiating table on this Brexit issue, and they have a role to play, continuing role to play in terms of safeguarding the Good Friday Agreement, and ultimately in delivering Irish unity referendums.
That's right.
If you want to tick something up there which has been a success, or where the US and where an activist talking to a Congress member has made a difference, it was seen yesterday when the British Prime Minister had to reach an agreement with the EU Commission President.
And now is not the time to take our foot off the gas on that work. If you want to find how to contact your representatives, you can find that on our website as well, because it is important that our voices are as loud and as clear as ever. Thank you, Ciarán, for your time again this month. We'll see you again, who knows from where, next time when we catch up and get the latest information. We really appreciate your time and sharing the information and latest updates.
Okay, Greg, it's always great to talk to everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, Mark. Thank you.